The Girl with the Suitcase is a foster care memoir from Angela Hart and one that I really thoroughly enjoyed. It's also very detailed. I don't know this for certain because I was reading the Kindle version, but I feel like it's much longer than the average foster carer memoir, and not in a way where things are dragged out because there is so much detail in there. I don't want to spoil too much, but I might, towards the end, with a spoiler warning, discuss the ending of this because, well, I'll just say the ending wasn't rushed, which often doesn't happen with foster care memoirs, but it did in this case. It was very, very well paced, but we got a lot of detail. And I wasn't left feeling like I needed more information. So if you hate books, and particularly foster care memoirs, where you're left with questions, this isn't going to be one of those. It's a very, very satisfying read. And this tells the story of Grace, who is at the time of the beginning 10 years old. And she's spent a good portion of her life in numerous foster homes. But what's quite interesting is that she actually goes home to her mother every couple of weeks, every couple of weekends, give or take, to spend time with her family. But her mother keeps telling her that she misbehaves and that she's too naughty and that she will perhaps be allowed to live with her when she learns to behave, which is absolutely disgusting. That is absolutely not how you treat your child, particularly since Grace's older sister Lily, who's a couple of years older than Grace, is allowed to live at the family home. It's just a horrible, horrible way to treat her. But Grace, we learn very quickly, isn't naughty. She's actually a people pleaser. She never, well, rarely does anything that she's not meant to. And the biggest problem is that actually she is just forgetful and very hyperactive. Now, reading this, I think it was very obvious that Grace had ADHD, but this is set at a time when basically nothing was known about ADHD, and it's quite eye opening to see just how far medical knowledge has come since this was written. This is not when it was written, but when it was set. This was set in the mid 90s. Grace is a big fan of Take That and Spice Girls, so you can kind of work out roughly when it was set from there. And it's incredible to think of just how far knowledge has come about ADHD in what is, all things considered, a relatively short space of time. And I'll be honest, it's an exhausting read to begin with because it's so well written. I think it does an excellent job of capturing just how high energy Grace is and just how exhausting it must have been to care for her. That's not to say I didn't get the impression Angela enjoyed caring for her because I very much, felt that she was happy to care for Grace, but I could also see how tiring it must have been to have to care for Grace when she's constantly running around everywhere, always asking questions, and she never stops. And as the story goes on, and we learn more about ADHD, there are some useful tips about coping strategies and mechanisms that can be put in place to help a child with ADHD. And I think that that could be really useful and really informative. I know there's a whole wealth of information on the internet. There are many, many books now about ADHD. But if you care for a child with ADHD and you haven't found any coping mechanisms that work, there might be some in this book that could help. And I think the book's doing a really great thing with that in mind. Angela cares for Grace for many, many years, and I think the pacing in this book is brilliant. For the most part, I'd say the first third of the book takes place over a year. I didn't, keep a full tab of the time, but Grace is roughly the same age for about the first third of the book. And then we kind of get a whistle stop tour of a few years after that, but not in a way that felt rushed. I felt fully up to date with everything. And then the final third of the book is about her kind of from the age of 15 onwards. And it's just remarkable to see the changes in her, but it doesn't mean there are no problems. And new problems are introduced later in the book. And I don't want to say any more about that, but I do want to praise the book for its use of the passage of time, the pacing, and I also found that it didn't feel as exhausting to read as it went on. And that's obviously because Grace had these coping mechanisms and her hyperactivity was starting to be managed more in other ways. And I feel like that really came across in the writing of the character and of Grace's if the dialogue with Grace, I think it was very, very well done. And I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. There were times when it was very frustrating with the way her mother talked to her. And I can only imagine how much Angela wanted to tell her to just shut up, but obviously not really her place to do that. It's definitely one of my favorite foster care memoirs in terms of how well it's written, how fascinating it is, how educational it can be. I don't want to say too much more about it because I definitely recommend it and I don't want to spoil any more. But I have to say, if you've never read any of Angela Hart's books or any foster care memoirs for that matter, I'd say this one is a pretty good place to start. It's not overly harrowing that you'll be traumatized by the treatment of the characters in this, but at the same time, it's really emotive and very well done. And this is the second time I've read it, and honestly, I feel like if I read it again, it'll be just as good. The Girl with the Suitcase is a really enjoyable, very well written book.